Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. With me, I have my good friend Veli. How are you, sir?
Hello, Sam. Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I got an interesting topic here that actually Veli proposed. If you cannot tell, both Veli and me are old. So we get to talk about some historical things and then how the landscape for .NET developers has evolved, with particularly with web development. But before we begin, Veli, why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. So I'm co-founder and CTO at Resolute Software. We are a professional service company that specializes in software modernization in the Microsoft ecosystem. We do a lot of full stack and full cycle development, ranging from UX UI design, software architecture, end-to-end development, testing, deployment, and operational maintenance. I've been in the industry for the last 16 now years, previously on different technical and leadership roles, including at Progress Software. And me and my team are really happy to see some nice developments in modern web development with .NET and with Microsoft technologies nowadays that I'm happy to talk about today.
Yeah. I've known Valley for quite some time. You're awesome, and we love all that you folks do at Resolute Software. You have
Thank
some
you.
really amazing minds and great folks. Let's kind of go back to the history. I know you want to talk about all of the latest cool things like Blazor and SSR and real time and render modes. But let's begin at the very beginning. I'm going to try to pull up a site here. So give me a second. I was looking it up and I actually bookmarked this because I thought it was nice. There is a site called .NET Curry, and they used to write a lot of content. I think they still do. But this was a good, refresher on the history of ASP.NET and how quickly things have evolved. So even prior to .NET, Veli, where did you start with .NET? Did you start with the early days of .NET?
Yeah, well, early or not so early, we can decide on that later. But thank you for bringing up the topic of a little bit of prior history, right? Because this is something that gets me excited as well, seeing that for not a lot of time in the human scale, we have a huge shift in the technology space, and even in the smaller scale of development with .NET or web development with .NET, there's been a huge change in technology, in mindset, in developer concern, and in developer attention over the last decade and a half, I would say. So I started .NET back in 2007.
Okay.
I believe it was .NET 2.0, which was
Yeah.
all the rage back then, and
Hmm.
Microsoft had just released ASP.NET Ajax.
Yeah.
So everyone was talking about Ajax, and everyone was like, "What does Ajax mean?" Right? Maybe what is ASP was already somewhat clear to the .NET developer, but Ajax was brand
It's new.
new.
They're very new.
Yeah, so this
So
this concept of synchronous JavaScript and
yeah,
XML was puzzling everyone, and
yeah,
everyone was
yeah,
saying,
yeah.
"So how come you are now able to do page updates without doing a full page
A
reload?"
full
Right? It
full
was like
post back.
magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I might be older here, Valley, because I go even further back. So 1998, like I'm in college and so on. We kind of see the early days of the web with HTML. But prior to like scripting languages like Perl or ASP, which is active server pages, we didn't have the server do a whole lot. You're just like serving up HTML. So we started doing some what was called classic ASP, which is prior to .NET even. This was just called ASP, and it was a lot of spaghetti code. So essentially, if you
Yep.
look through some of the history here, prior to ASP.NET, it was a lot of script tags that would run on the server and they'll ship some content in HTML to the browser, which wasn't very scalable. It led to a lot of spaghetti code because your markup and your code was kind of very tightly knit together. So come 2002, we have .NET, which is Microsoft. So I mean, there are other players like Java and other folks, trying to do their thing on the web. But Microsoft comes out with .NET, which is an abstraction. It's a platform for building all types of apps. It makes a lot of things easier for OS level things. And along with it comes ASP.NET for the first time. And if you remember, Veli, in those days, Microsoft was trying to make sure that Windows developers, like if you did VB6 or VB.NET, and if you did Windows applications, your desktop development should be very similar to web development. So
Yes.
hence the name, like WinForms for desktop and then WebForms for web. And this, started back in 2002, and some might say it's still going strong because it was very productive. So
Yeah, it
um,
is. Ask me and my team because we're still working on
yeah,
web forms
yeah,
project,
exactly,
even with the objective of modernizing some of it.
yeah,
But we're still in a position of maintaining and expanding on those.
yeah.
It's a resilient piece of tech for sure.
It absolutely is. So, just the way we did like desktop development, like this is very old school Visual Studio, where you had a canvas, right? You had an ASPX page, which is kind of the thing that you're trying to render, and you will drag and drop things on the page. And then each page was kind of like a partial class. You had the front end of it, and then when you clicked on a button or hit a drop down, you will have a code behind, and that code behind is executing on the server side. So you come back to the server, the whole thing is a form, right? And you used to post back the whole thing to the server. Yeah, and this was, and still is like very productive. But what are your thoughts on web forms, like how it started and how it
Yeah.
evolved?
Yeah. Well, back in the day when I started working with it, I was thinking about why the heck did someone come up with the notion of having your web application behave like a typical desktop app, right? What's the
Exactly.
idea behind having everything in one big form that gets submitted as one to the server? And then, if you remember, there were these magical fields with the view state
Oh,
and
yes,
the
yes.
session state or control
Yeah,
state, I think it was,
yeah,
that were these cryptic base64 encoded fields that contain basically your client state, which was
yeah,
sent back to the server with every page postbacks. And I was thinking like, okay, what's the deal here? Why would someone go through all the hassle of abstracting the client server communication between or in a web application to such an extent that it really you cannot tell that this is a web application. You have the feeling that you are developing a classic desktop application.
yeah.
And
And
then
that,
there was an architect back in the day that I was working with who was kind enough to enlighten me. And he was like, who do you think this technology was built for? So it turns out this was primarily built for the classic VB developer back in the
exactly,
day, who
desktop
was the
developers.
primary developer persona for Microsoft technologies. And
Yep,
every engineer working on .NET was focused on getting the VB developer to start writing in C# and to start building web applications with it. So they had to come up with a framework or an abstraction that was familiar enough for the VB developer building a classic Windows Forms application.
yep,
So this is how it got to me. Okay, so the idea was to make this as close to desktop development patterns and paradigm as possible.
yep.
Turns out it
Exactly.
was a successful bet because
Was.
looking backwards, I see every now and then a major web forms application still being in service, still being updated and maintained diligently to the point where engineering teams are now pushed by Microsoft to modernize simply at the threat of having this technology obsolete now and under the fear that it will at some point just stop working. Otherwise, they all believe there's nothing work with it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, and it still keeps working, and we're happy maintaining this, and it gets the job done. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So again, to your point, I think they were trying to lure the desktop classic, desktop developers, VB6 developers into this fold, and in the process, they kind of hid the realities of the web, like what is HTTP, what's HTML, going back and forth, and to your point, what you just said, like everything that you had in the form had to be posted back to the server, and when you came back to the client, you didn't want the user to lose all of that state as to what they had selected. So view state was a big thing, and it was a baggage that we carried back and forth, no matter how many number of trips it took to just maintain state. But
Yep.
It was a productive system. It was very simple. Like page lifecycle was super simple. Just do a get and then keep posting back to the same page until you're done with it.
Yes,
So yeah, and they started doing a little bit of modernization, like you mentioned, Ajax. And again, like newer, younger people might not even know what all of this means. So Ajax is asynchronous, JavaScript and XML, because XML was big those days. So we learned that maybe it's not a good idea to post this entire thing and refresh the entire page over and over again. Maybe we can have a small segment of the page be posting and refreshing. So that was the idea of
yes,
Ajax. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And by the way, by introducing Ajax, Microsoft had to finally start disclosing their or the developers' need to think about how the client and the server works. It was like maybe for the first time, the web developer in .NET had to think about how this thing is going to go back from the client to the server and then back again to the client, because web forms was so abstracted, so indirect in the client server communication, that we developers did not really have to think about all this inner workings of the web. And now with
Yeah.
Ajax, Microsoft said, okay, so now for the first time you're distinguishing between two different types of client communication or client server communication. One is the full page load or postback, and the other is a partial reload or partial postback. And then developers slowly started thinking, okay, so there's this thing called client server communication, and maybe we need to start thinking about it, right? So the
I,
you
I,
know the
Veli, I was just going to say, like, I don't know about you, like, this brings back memories and like some horror stories that I have done. Like, remember the XML HTTP request? Like, that's how we did Ajax.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also remind you that before the XML HTTP request object became standard in the browser, in all the browsers, there was the Internet Explorer specific ActiveX component
Oh, yes.
that was responsible for the same duty,
Yeah.
but they did not have a standards compliant implementation of the XML HTTP request back in the day.
Hmm.
So we're talking about Internet Explorer 6
Yeah.
days, which was a crazy thing on its own to maintain and support.
Yeah, we have come a long way. And chapter, if you're just joining, we are just reminiscing about how the web technologies have evolved, particularly in the .NET stack and where things are right now. So Veli and me are kind of starting from the beginning. But I mean, this was a good first step. Like you see the client script manager, we are starting to do a little bit of JavaScript on the pages as needed. But along the way, as ASP.NET is evolving, like this started with ASP.NET 2.0, the underlying framework is .NET framework, and that is evolving as well. So like between 2002 and like 2008, 9, like we went from .NET 2.0 to like .NET 4 or maybe 3 something,
3.5,
3.5.
3.5.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it was a good journey because the framework evolved a lot. The programming languages got so much better. Object oriented, generics were supported. So
yeah.
it was a good place to be.
And MVC came
Yeah,
to today, right? Came to light
2000
because
2009-ish, I think.
yeah, I think it was 2008,
Yeah,
2009. Microsoft introduced MVC, the whole new crazy way of building web applications now, which for the first time was a pattern that was true to the way the client and the server work in their
yeah,
communication.
yeah,
So now we got two things available for developers. First of all, you have the concept of how something from the server will get sent to the client, right? You have the concept of a view that is sent to the client as it is, or that is sent to the client with some data resolved into the HTML. And then you have the controller, which is the server thing now that takes care of the processing and everything. And then really you have the model that is the data that goes in between the two. Right. So for the first time, you have the separation of concerns between the front end, the
right,
back end, and the data uh, format or the data
yeah,
structure that is used in communication. And now
yeah,
the other thing that was introduced, if you remember, they introduced the concept of data-only requests. So before that, in web forms, everything was basically a resolution of the page object, right?
yeah,
Something is happening on the server, and what you get is a page with some HTML script, whatever you have there. And MVC said, okay, so your controller is now also able to send data models in
yeah,
certain alternative formats, let's say
Yep.
JSON or
Mhm.
XML, right? So it was for the first time that you have the controller methods that return data objects and not just the plain HTML page that was
Right.
generated, which
So
was
the
revolutionary when you think
Yeah.
about it.
So the early stages of APIs, like we are returning data.
Yes.
So MVC, it was a design pattern, like model view controller. And if you remember, like the web, like outside of the .NET ecosystem was also evolving. There was Ruby on Rails, and other folks were doing MVC before this. And Microsoft wanted to adopt this, sooner, but kind of landed in 2008-9 timeframe. And I remember the early days where this was a little bit confusing. Like if you first came in from like web forms background, like what is a controller? Like why am I trying to return HTML sometimes? Why am I trying to return like data sometimes? So this was quite a change. And I remember the fighting, because like some folks were so tied up to web forms and that's the only thing they wanted to do. And then MVC comes along and some folks were sold. So I think eventually the decision was, let's just do both. Let's keep both. And we ran with that mode in a while, where if you had a web forms app, like you could still render some MVC within that, and then you can have them coexist.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was good days back in the day, right? Because you had a progressive introduction of important concepts that
Yeah.
developers slowly got their heads around and started really thinking about their web applications as as things happening on the internet, things happening between a client and the server, which was the right mindset for building web applications. Now, if we fast forward to today a bit, it gets crazy very quickly because nobody back then was talking about server-side components versus client-side
Yeah.
components, progressive rendering, progressive web applications,
Yeah, because
progressive enhancement,
we didn't
uh,
understand any of that
yeah,
stuff.
SignalR and real-time communication. All they were concerned about is getting a bunch of data from the client and the server for doing of which you had, I don't know, two or three options max.
Yeah.
And today it's you have streaming rendering, you have real-time communication and versus REST APIs. You have in real-time communication, is it SignalR or gRPC? In
Mhm.
REST APIs, are you going to still use JSON or can we optimize with message pack, right?
Yeah.
Questions like this, concerns like this, that really created, to me, this really created the notion of web developer fatigue. You know, Back in the crazy days of rapid JavaScript library development, if you remember the time between, let's say, 2009, 2013, everybody was coming up with their own JavaScript framework. It was crazy. You had so many options for picking a specific implementation of a concern, like routing, like templating, MVC framework, that developers simply had too many options. And this is when the term JavaScript fatigue was coined to really explain the notion of too much choice for the developer.
Yeah.
And if you compare to today, I still think that you have too much choice of technique, of patterns and paradigms, even in the limited space of just the .NET framework capabilities for web developers, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly you have a complete shift of mindset in the developer, who is where, and not even the mindset, but also the skill set, because last week, we were having a discussion in my team about the need to recruit .NET developers. So we are us being a .NET focused shop, we constantly are on the lookout for .NET ninjas of all ages and backgrounds. And we were discussing about, okay, so what do we need to put in the job ad? What is the scope of the .NET developer today that we're recruiting for? And when I thought about it, okay, so back in the day, when somebody was recruiting a .NET developer, it was pretty clear when you say C# and .NET. This really meant that you were doing either WinForms or web forms. You had a good understanding of C# and .NET framework, and maybe a little bit of JavaScript. And if you could work with the Microsoft Ajax library on the JavaScript side, you were king. Now that was the entire scope of the technical skill that you were recruiting for. Fast forward to today, what is the .NET? What is the web developer in .NET? Is that a backend developer with .NET? a full stack developer with JavaScript and .NET, a Blazor developer with full stack C Sharp capabilities, a real time application developer with SignalR, an all data based REST API developer in C Sharp. So all those
So
crazy
varied.
notions
Yeah.
of too much choice of patterns and paradigms in the small .NET framework that is specializing in some kind of applications, but still gives you, trying to give you the best of the industry in one package just creates a lot of choice
Yeah.
for you that you sometimes get lost into.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And again, I mean, if your fundamentals are in place, then you can learn. Thankfully, we do have folks in the chat room who are, I think, as old as you and me here. Full Schnabel, good to see you. Yeah, classic ASP. That was a way back, even before .NET. Uh, Win32, yeah, I mean that's on the web, desktop side, and that story evolved and changed, and a lot of things came and gone as we evolved. But
Yeah, well,
let's talk about web.
Win32 in assembly could realistically be easier than web dev today. I agree with that. It was crazy to think about that some 15 years ago, but today
Yeah,
it might actually hold true.
yeah. Yeah, and went through a lot of things like cross-site scripting course and COBOL. I did a couple of years of COBOL, so yeah, very yeah. Win32 is still there, so a lot of choices in the desktop native stuff. But let's come back to the web because you mentioned a couple of things. Like we see MVC kind of grow from 2008 onwards, all the way up to like maybe 2015 ish, and it coexisted nicely with web forms. Like we had clients who would do both and they would slowly start modernizing and migrating to MVC. I think what is important though is maybe in the 2012 to 14 timeframe, we also see other aspects of ASP.NET kind of grow up. Like you mentioned, SignalR. This little piece here is for real-time communications between multiple clients that are all connected up to one server. David Fowler, Damien Edwards, those folks were working on it, and we also see like MVC being really good with web APIs. So like serving up content, serving up data from a backend, driven by a model that's connected to Entity Framework or SQL Server. So things got really good. And this whole idea of one ASP.NET where let's just combine everything for sites and services. This was a rage. Here is a course again, like Fulshner was suggesting. So we came a long way with MVC. That's maybe up until like 2015, 2016 timeframe. What were your thoughts going through that journey, like from 2008 to 2016?
Yeah, I would say it was peaceful times for the .NET developer. Why? Because thankfully for this time, he had to focus on honing his or her JavaScript skills. So MVC was a major step ahead for Microsoft, but it had a major gap as well. It did not solve the client-side uh, uh, rich internet application concept, or the idea that your client now needs to propose or to offer richer interactivity and
Yeah,
experiences because the web is progressing and
because and, and also
nobody is
browsers have come
writing
a long
just
way.
server pages anymore, right?
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
MVC was the perfect server page paradigm, in my opinion. At least I've written my fair share of MVC after my even better share of WinForms back in the day. But the JavaScript, the client-side interactivity piece was left for the developer to figure out on their own, or almost figure out, because you still had the community was very, very beneficial. The ecosystem was very helpful because this is the day where I believe some of the best developer components, UI components, came to the market,
Yeah.
solving a lot of the JavaScript interactivity hassles for the developer by abstracting almost the entire set of JavaScript required for that. So
Yeah.
you had tag helpers, you had
Mhm.
controls, you had client-server communication or hidden Ajax call behinds for those controls, loading data, doing whatever that they need, without you ever having to think about writing major amounts of JavaScript for this type of interactiveness. But
Yeah.
this is also the transition of the .NET developer now becoming a full stack web developer, because at the end of the day, you had to hone up your JavaScript skills. You had to start writing more JavaScript, more HTML, maybe a little bit of CSS. You had to start thinking about the DOM and the concept of how this thing is going to play out on the client and not just on the server. So MVC or .NET for web development was really becoming a full stack story now, right?
Yeah, yeah. In the chat room, VVG Online. I'm with you. I started with VV6 as well, and boy, those were good times because we had a thick client and IDE that was kind of getting started. Thankfully, I didn't do much Flash. Did you, Veli?
No, I did not do. I did a fair amount of VB script
Yeah.
ActiveX components, but
Mhm.
not a lot of
Yeah.
Flash per se.
Yeah, and along the way, we'll talk about it. Like I did, like 2 years of Silverlight because we thought, hey, the XAML that you're writing for your desktop apps, why not take it to the web? And then Flash and Silverlight and the whole plugin model for the web. Like we know how that ended. So just wasn't scalable. So let's move forward here a little bit more. So let's see if part three here covers more of that. So I think along the way, like mid 2015, 2016 timeframe, we also see they used to call this ASP.NET VNext. Now you see like Scott Hanselman, David Fowler, and those folks, because the web was evolving rapidly on other platforms as well. And it was just much more of a collaborative, open environment for folks to, like you talked about, how JavaScript frameworks came along once every day. So it was just more open, more libraries, more things to play around with, while .NET kind of still was stuck to Windows and it was like a closed off ecosystem. So I think what we see is the influence of open source, with coming into .NET, and ASP.NET Core was a huge jump because not only is the web stack evolving, but the underlying runtime is evolving as well. So by this point, .NET framework, I think we were at 4.8 or something. It was a giant. It was a monolithic beast where it did so many things and so many application stacks dependent on it. I remember IT departments would have like a month-long plan to just upgrade your .NET framework. It was just too big. So the decision, I think, was to make it easier, to lower the barrier to entry so anybody could come in and do .NET, break it up. So now it becomes modular. Now it becomes open source and cross-platform. And that's .NET Core, and ASP.NET Core is running on it. And for the first time, we see it being running on Linux and or Mac OS, and you can deploy it on any cloud that you want. So, do you remember the early days of ASP.NET Core? Like, were you jumping on it, Veli?
Absolutely. There's two things that I remember particularly well here. The .NET Run command that was
Hmm.
Linux friendly, which
Yeah,
was crazy, being able to spin up a quick Linux distro and just run your .NET application and start let's say an API server quickly somewhere on a Linux environment. It was a very welcome addition to the .NET portfolio for all kinds of developers. And the second was the Kestrel server, because
yeah,
Kestrel,
yeah.
when it came out, when Kestrel came out, it was, first of all, it was the first attempt of Microsoft and .NET the .NET development team to propose a self-hosted application server type of a model,
Right.
but they were just one major framework behind. Node.js was all the rage back then.
Hmm.
And everyone started comparing the Kestrel server to Node.js in terms of performance, particularly in terms of HTTP request rates. The amount of, or the number of HTTP requests that the server could handle for any particular second.
Right.
So the first version of Kestrel, I don't remember was the throughput here, but I think the second or the third version of the Kestrel was on par, if not better, to
Yeah,
Node.js, for the
yeah,
very specific reason that the web development community was immediately comparing it to Node.js in terms of performance. So
right.
those were the two big the two big developments in the ecosystem back in the .NET Core days that I remember.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, ASP.NET Core is still the reality. I mean, we have evolved the front end stack a little bit on top of ASP.NET Core, but this is still the reality. And to your point, like since there was so much of competition and people always compared, like the throughput, like just a web API serving up data from a backend service, ASP.NET Core is really really fast. Like it's multitudes of order faster than your Node.js in today's times. So a lot of effort and investment went in to streamline just the parts of .NET that you need to run your app and like no more. So just like as streamlined as possible. Yeah, and that story kept on evolving. I remember the .NET Core launch, Kestrel servers. Yeah, so that's been quite the history. So, like, if you look at modern ASP.NET, and all of this started from like somebody asking me, what is ASP.NET? So, if you look at ASP.NET right now, it's a stack that does a lot of things, right? So yes, you can build well web apps easily, because that's something we have been doing for the web forms days. You can still do web forms, you can still do MVC. Those are not being actively developed, but they're maintained and they're fine if you want to be on .NET framework. And again, a lot of people ask, like especially on the desktop stack, like, is WinForms dead, is WPF dead, or web forms dead? No, they're running just fine. In fact, WinForms and WPF on the desktop side, they run on the latest .NETs like .NET 9. Web Forms is a .NET framework only thing, and again, that's going to be a part of .NET framework, and it's a part of Windows as long as Windows will be around. So you can run this forever, but you want to maybe move forward to earlier, more modern times and more performance. So that's where you're going to get into ASP.NET Core. So you can build your web apps, you can build your APIs. This is the part that's really, really fast. You can do SignalR real time. So, Veli, you talked about this. I remember they having to rebuild SignalR almost from scratch again for ASP.NET Core, because
Yes.
now this architecture was a little different. And we see microservices. We see different types of runtimes and different ways to split up your applications. So,
Yes.
what are your thoughts on modern ASP.NET today? ASP.NET
Yeah,
Core.
well, I have an overwhelming thought here every time I think about modern.NET, because modern.NET to me is equivalent to modern web development. Why? Because all the major web development frameworks, regardless of whether .NET, Microsoft provided, or open source community projects like Node.js, React, Next.js, Angular, they all converge on the same patterns and practices that are universally accepted as industry best practices here. And to me, this is a very good thing. Why? Because back in the day, when we were recruiting .NET developers, we required them to have a very specific set of skills and understanding about web technology and web technology with .NET, because this was unique to .NET versus, let's say, doing web development with PHP or with Java or with Python. Not anymore today. Today, whether I work with .NET or you work with React, we all share the same concepts and understanding of microservices, real-time communication. I could say I want to use SignalR. You can say I want to use SignalIO. APIs. If we're building REST APIs, for example, we can easily converge on, let's say, OpenAPI, or doing some kind of other protocol and standard that is equally supported, ecosystems and technologies. And really, the life of the modern .NET developer is the samely rich and extensive understanding of how modern web technologies work as the life of, let's say, the full stack JavaScript developer or the Python developer, because the implementation details could be different, but the concepts that we are seeing over and over again are so heavily reused that now it's just a little bit easier for any web developer to take up on .NET, or for
Yeah.
any .NET developer to take up on web,
Yeah.
because the skill set is completely transferable, of course, minus the specific library details and
Yeah.
SDK,
Conditions are.
minor details.
Yeah. So, speaking of, where things are, I love this comment here, because this is where so many of us are. We love modern ASP.NET Core. We love, Blazor. So let's talk about this actually. So
Yeah,
prior to 2016, like, you have ASP.NET Core, which is fast and it's modern, but it still has its roots in server-side technology. Like, it is server-side first. Yes, you can do Ajax all day. You can do MVC controllers, but nothing is running completely on the client side. And modern browsers are like a VM. So I actually remember this. Steve Sanderson, who works on the ASP.NET team, really smart engineer, and at Microsoft they do like some hackathons, and he had come up with a prototype of what would be eventually Blazor. And this was NDC Oslo, which is a big conference that happens actually coming up in June of this year. Again, he showed off this prototype and just kind of blew everybody's minds that for the first time you can take .NET and run it completely on the client side. That was through WebAssembly. But Blazor also has multiple modes of working. You can be completely server side with a SignalR bridge that maintains the shadow DOM. DOM, by the way, is document object model. That's what your user is seeing, like the HTML visual tree. And then you maintain that, you update parts of that, or it can be completely shipped client side to WebAssembly. So, Veli, where did you start with
Yeah.
Blazor, and what do you see? How do you like Blazor today?
Yeah, I started with Blazor at the very early stages, very early days. Actually, me and my team are one of the major adopters of Blazor in our projects, and we have been working with Blazor since some developer preview version. And
Yeah,
actually,
same.
this same version we used that to start a major Blazor based project.
Yeah.
So it's still ongoing. And back in the day, the JavaScript interop capabilities between Blazor and the JavaScript runtime were not very good. So we had to get very creative here. And there was this notion. So Microsoft was pitching Blazor as the ability to write C# only for your web application. Well, we
Right.
did not really think so, because Blazor was good. Being able to write C# in the browser was awesome, but it nowhere nearly, reduce the need to write JavaScript, or let us free of the need to understand how things work in the DOM or in the
Because
browser and in the
Also, I
browser
think
APIs.
the other thing is, like, if you did a modern spa web application in the last 10 years, like before like Blazor comes into the play, you did JavaScript. So what happens to your
Sure.
investments? You cannot just like, forget about the JavaScript that you wrote. Those have to now coexist with your modern .NET.
Yeah, absolutely. And back in those days, Blazor did not really stand a chance exactly against that argument that if I've been invested in JavaScript for the last 5, 6, 7 years, doing Angular, doing React, you are not really solving many more problems here, or solving any particular problem better, save for maybe reusing some code between the client and the server, if that code happens to be written in C# and into a .NET Standard library, right? Now, those things were developed and were improved very quickly. Now, Blazor is a major player in the web development space, because Microsoft really implemented all the best practices in modern web technologies and web frameworks, including full stack frameworks, into a concept of Blazor to really be your one-stop shop for application development, regardless of whether some components run on the client, others run on the server. So
Yeah,
they introduced this concept of a hosting model, that
yeah,
you could run Blazor on the server, or you could run it on the client with WebAssembly, or you could run it in a hybrid environment with some
yeah.
cross-platform applications
Yeah,
with MAUI or WPF.
mobile and desktop. Yeah,
Yeah,
so and I think the tooling also gets much better with Blazor, and now you have different types of hosting models. You could have a modern web view rendering the same Blazor UI on mobile or desktop. Again, this is nothing new. Like folks like Electron have done this a long time, but that was Node.js based. So you shipped Chromium with it, and it was suitable for desktop, not suitable for mobile. But modern web views, if you have a modern browser, you can render Blazor UI. It is a particularly good match with .NET MAUI, because then you have the same exact runtime, all your Blazor code. Like there is no server or client on mobile or desktop. You're literally on the client. So it's fast. Like performance is very good. .NET is running on the metal. So I think Blazor, just the portability of Blazor really makes it very,
yeah,
suitable. And
absolutely.
to your point, the JavaScript interoperability has come a long way. So now you can, .NET and JavaScript can talk to each other much better.
Absolutely. They can talk to each other much better. And now the community, the ecosystem is much more mature now, to the point where you have a lot of choice for Blazor components, for application building blocks that are written in Blazor, or that fully support Blazor, to the point where you really need to write very little, JavaScript for just a very specific scenario that you may not have an available component or third-party, extension for.
Yeah,
And for those scenarios where you do need to write some JavaScript, now it's a much more pleasant experience, because you have the option of easily sharing SignalR connections between the client or the server when you need, or interrupting some small amounts of data between JavaScript and your Blazor side, or even avoiding JavaScript by really adopting just the UI component piece of something small that you don't have in Blazor be into JavaScript, and then writing a small wrapper component in Blazor for that, and make it standalone for your .NET developer to a point where once it's written, you're still within the Blazor and C# space beyond that, and you don't have to dwell into the inner implementation details with JavaScript. So
Yeah.
now it's truly a modular, a segmented, and a widely extensible framework that gives you a lot of choice, including not opposing or not slapping you in the hand if you want to go more JavaScript and less Blazor, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
in a major project that we were involved in, we had to come up with so we were working on a geo information system, a major application that was running basically on an entire map of the world. Imagine like Google Earth with additional capabilities of being able to track objects and create routes and play routes back as they happened in for aircraft and other vessels, for example. So this component was entirely JavaScript. I mean, the map component was JavaScript. There was no alternative for Blazor. But then the entire on-screen UI beyond the map was Blazor. And we were able to abstract things so well with Blazor and the .NET framework in WebAssembly that the JavaScript implementation details were abstracted and wrapped in their own Blazor component. And then the majority of the communication was between a Blazor and another Blazor component, to the point where you really had little need to do JavaScript interop, which is
Yeah.
crazy because when you have a high velocity, high volume, real-time application, the interoping Java objects between JavaScript and Blazor has its own performance implication, because at the end of the day, data needs to cross runtime boundaries.
Yeah.
It needs to be serialized from JavaScript and then deserialized into the .NET COR in WebAssembly. So it
Exactly.
has a non-significant overhead for large data.
Yeah.
And then Blazor allowed us to architect this application on the client side so well so as to minimize the scenarios in which we need to interrupt anything, including by opening up dual SignalR channels for the Blazor and the JavaScript layers independently, or not independently, but simultaneously, to the point where the client could say whether it requests a specific piece of data for the Blazor side or for the JavaScript side. And then the server would know that they need to send this data through the specific Blazor or JavaScript SignalR hub, so as to avoid marshaling the data between JavaScript and Blazor. So yes, it took some ingenuity to come up with a good solution or solution architecture for this, but then kudos to Blazor because it allowed us to circumvent its limitations when necessary and still keep the majority of the code base in C# with the
Yeah.
benefit of sharing code across the client and the server, and of course to the benefit of all the .NET developers in the team.
Yeah, yeah, well said. So I remember this as well because like we started with Blazor very early, and this started with .NET 6. So the other thing that Blazor ecosystem brings in is just the nicety of having so much at your disposal. Tools are great, and again, I'm obviously biased here, but there's a lot of help with your UI. Like we have always built a lot of web UI for Telerik and Kenda UI, but like our Blazor suite, in like 4 years, it's come such a long way. So any type of UI that you want to create from your app, I mean, it's right there. So you can play around with this just in your browser without installing anything. So there's and again, we're not the only players. There's a lot more UI from other folks. There are libraries. So use whatever you need, whatever works for your app to make it nice, make your environment productive.
Yeah,
So
and
that's something.
absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So
Exactly right. And when you need to optimize beyond the capabilities of the UI and the framework, I'm very happy to see that Blazor is a promoter of very good performance concepts that they have been around for a while, but maybe the .NET developer has not thought about them intensively in their typical .NET development work. But now, because we're talking about client-server applications that are getting bigger, more complex, more intense, more interactive, it's inevitable that we start thinking about performance optimizations. And I'm
Oh, yeah.
very happy to see that Blazor has some awesome performance concepts that they introduced or reintroduced to the .NET developer in a major way that is now getting a lot of attention. I can mention things like code stripping,
Mhm.
a concept that we have known from the JavaScript community, like tree shaking.
Yeah.
Really, any type of modern JavaScript build tooling supports tree shaking because
Yeah.
JavaScript packages are getting bigger and bigger. The same
Yeah.
thing is now done by the intermediate language trimmer in the
Yeah.
.NET, in the Blazor runtime, or in the
Yeah.
.NET build tooling, to enable just the minimum amount of Blazor code that needs to be
Yeah.
compiled and turned into a WebAssembly over to the browser. Then we
Yeah.
have HTTP response compression,
Mhm.
including with alternative transport formats like, let's say, gRPC and message pack. How many developers have used message pack on a daily basis, trying to squeeze every last single byte
Yeah.
from their JSON payloads when data velocity and data size really matters, right? We also have things like, let's say, code caching in the browser. Previously, in the .NET Web Forms and MVC world, everyone's talking about request-only caching or the cache control headers in the browser. Now, developers are thinking about caching also their code assets, because code assets are non-trivial payload that immediately affect application load and reload times.
Yeah.
Right, and then we have
Yeah.
other code level optimizations that we can talk about for quite a while here. Just-in-time compilation, ahead of time compilation, and I'm very happy to see that these are all very similar practices and patterns from the JavaScript world, because the
Yeah.
JavaScript world has been around for a lot of time now, and it's probably the fastest developing community that every framework developer is catching up with. So
Yeah.
V8, for example, has the notion of hidden classes or function inlining or other aspects of JavaScript uh, optimization, so that it is jittable, for the runtime is able to just in time compile it and create better bytecode or better execution code out of it. The same concept is now used by Blazor to do ahead of time compilation, that
Mhm.
allows you to create .NET assemblies ported immediately into WebAssembly and executed much faster by the browser versus the .NET CLR, jitting some of it and then interpreting the rest on
Yeah.
the client. Right, so
Yeah.
awesome
Awesome.
performance concepts like this that the Blazor ecosystem is promoting more and more for the .NET developer, which is a
Right.
crazy good thing, because any high quality experienced web developer is one that thinks about those concepts on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah. I think jitterbug needs to be a word that's added to the English dictionary.
Is it not
But
already?
I mean, to your point though, like if you look at how we have built modern apps, like you have to think about these things. Like if you put a Blazor app as a PWA, as WebAssembly, you have to think about performance. You have to think about how you bundle up things, because the classic thing about shipping so much of .NET DLLs to the client side means your startup experience is just stuttering until your app gets all the things that it
Absolutely.
needs.
And by the way,
So
thank you for mentioning PWA, because PWA
yeah,
was a very elusive concept for the .NET developer before Blazor. And now
yeah,
it's a very specific type of application and architectural concept that every Blazor developer or every .NET developer doing web development can relate to, because it
yeah,
really means Blazor WebAssembly that is been designed together with the client-server communication patterns in a way that it can work offline and is optimized for patchy or missing connectivity. Awesome,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Now, along the way, like Blazor started life in like .NET 6-ish, 2007 timeframe, but now it's growing up with .NET 7, .NET 8, and moving on to .NET 9. You mentioned a few things about SSR, which is like server-side rendering or pre-rendering. I also know they did a bunch of work with the new render modes that are coming, or I mean, they're
Yep.
there in .NET 8. So can you talk through some of this?
Absolutely. Render modes and really server-side rendering is all the rage in the web community overall. Right? Look at what happens on the React side with server-side
Mhm.
server-side components. Next.js framework developers declaring that all of their React components will be server side by default, server rendered. That means, and then there's different modes of rendering, whether this is static, interactive, streaming rendering. So all awesome concepts that now the web ecosystem in general is progressing with at the same rate that the Blazor development community is getting introduced to. So now it's the moment when Blazor is on par with the general web development community and is
Yeah.
really going hand in hand with the latest and greatest in trends. And to me personally, it's a great little performance enabler because when we are optimizing for the fastest, let's say, first contentful write or first interaction that are typical performance metrics in web applications, it's awesome to see that your development framework and tooling supports these optimizations as first-class citizens by choosing whether your component is immediately rendered to the server, at which point it behaves like a static server page that immediately gets the HTML to your eyes, whether it's streaming by uh, making sure that whatever could be shown to the user is shown as quickly as
As
possible.
quickly as
And then
possible. Right.
if we have to
Then
wait
you
for some data
switch
loading,
right.
then there
Yeah.
is going to be additional streams of changes coming, and then the UI updates
Yeah.
accordingly and immediately. You could probably imagine how much effort developers had to go through to implement something like this, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was crazy custom tooling. It was a lot of JavaScript, a lot of trial and error, very patchy success, and very unstable type of application that was not very resilient to developer changes or to UI changes overall. And all of these
Yeah.
things are now just a set of instructions in your
And they're
eraser
like
codes, code
they're
files,
like
right?
it's an enumeration. Like you just choose which ones you want, like static
Yeah,
server side, interactive server, WASM, or interactive auto. Yeah, and to me, it seems like especially older people like you and me, like we see the pendulum swing, right? We started with completely server side, then we came completely client side, and maybe the reality, depending on the type of app you're building, is somewhere in between. You want to mix and match because, especially if you're rendering things as a PWA, you want that quick load up experience, but then streaming things down as the user is more spending more time on your app. So it's nice that modern frameworks are giving us that switchability.
absolutely. So, and having choice and having to choose between multiple good options is awesome because
Yeah,
back in the day we were struggling to get the best choice that we know is going to guarantee performance. Now all of these choices are available immediately with very little change to your code, and then the implications of taking one choice versus another is immediately understandable. It's well explained, it's well documented. These are industry best practices that developers have come up on their own
yeah,
for many years and try to understand, try to document, and try to explain to fellow developers that are now being taken as standard implementation patterns that major
yeah,
frameworks are adopting. And I'm very happy to
yeah,
see Microsoft and Blazor be a
yeah,
first-class, adopter of these best practices. It's
yeah,
it's uh, it's a
and
win-win
often
situation for all.
it is, and often, like to your point, like there may not be one particular pattern that suits every type of user or every type of application. So I like the automatic mode where it starts with something and then switches to something else based on your network, based on your payload size. So all good things happening. Chat room. VVG Online is saying Apple is trying to kill the PWAs. It's a debatable thing,
They're
I do.
trying, but yeah,
it
they
it
could
kind of
try.
goes against their monetization model, but they are also smart enough to understand that they can't because it's a lot of store apps are essentially PWAs. You might put a wrapper around them with some store APIs or device APIs that you're consuming, but PWAs are here to stay. Some might say like Safari is the new IE6, but they get along. They might not adhere to all the standards like the Chromium based browsers do, but it's getting along. Yeah. So I mean, you and me have talked about quite the history in the last 20 years, but What's your wish list? Where do you see things going for web development, going forward? How do you see the .NET developer evolving with it?
Yeah, I think the future is bright, really, Sam. And now finishing up, as you know, in a circle here, we started by saying how the life of the .NET developer changed here for the last 15 or 20 years. And I'm very happy to see that, yes, although technologies are getting more complex, more concepts, more patterns and paradigms to think about, it's still manageable. And it's manageable because it's well defined, it's well supported, clearly explained, and then you get the major. I mean, you get the benefits of major industry developments in modern web application concepts, particularly around performance, around accessibility, even the progressive web application story that we were talking about. It really democratizes access to application experiences for all users, including browser and web users, right? So it's a major thing to see happening equally on the .NET side, because uh, to me, .NET is one of the best frameworks for application development overall. And seeing ASP.NET and Blazor in recent versions, I could say that it's one of the best web application frameworks. And even though like 3 years ago, I could argue that there's still something to be desired from the Blazor and .NET side in terms of some modern concepts and paradigms. Today, I could say it's really on par with the best and the latest and greatest in web application development. And it's really a matter of preference here, whether I want to go with go the JavaScript side with something like React or Angular, or go full stack C# side with something like Blazor and .NET, with all things being equal. If I have more concern about sharing code between a .NET and a front-end application, for example, then the choice is clear. And I can rest assured that I'm not making any compromises on the front end, on the web application development side, by simply needing to share code or to share some additional data or patterns and practices between the client and the server. And it's awesome to see these developments.
Yeah, yeah, very, very, very well said. I think to your point, the fact that modern web developers don't think any different from a modern .NET developer is really nice. That it's we all have our evolved ways of understanding how modern web should work, and it's nice to see .NET and Blazor kind of encouraging and following those trends. To Fuchsnabel's points, like how manageable is this? uh, I also do get the sometimes the overwhelming aspect of understanding modern web, because there is a lot. Like I mean, can you really be a full stack developer? Like front end itself has like 5 different stacks, and everything combined with your services stack, with your microservices, and then all the way back to your data. It's a lot. But hopefully you're not having to do every aspect of that whole thing. So pick and choose the things that your application, your team needs to work on, and understand the concepts, understand how things work, because frameworks and languages, they'll come and go. As long as our fundamentals are in place, we can all learn and go along with the times.
Yeah, absolutely. Modern .NET is exciting. No need to go back to Win32 with assembly.
No, Fulschnabel will disagree, but hey, it's all coexisting. Oh, RAD. RAD used to be a thing before ASP.NET was a thing, and actually, you still can use RAD if you don't mind me saying this, because like Telerik UI has its origins with very early versions of web forms, so a lot of our UI is still called like RAD this and RAD that. So we still hold on to the RAD name in some ways. Veli, I appreciate your knowledge. You're such a smart guy and always bring so much of context and history, and yeah, just the overall knowledge of how the web has evolved. So always good to chat with you, and appreciate your time just coming on and walking through a little bit of history with me, and just how things have evolved.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sam, and for chatting passionately with me about some cool stuff that is going on.
Yeah, and chat room here. Who knows? Like you might say, this is one of the best times to be a .NET developer, but we have said that before, and we might be saying it more. Could it be more of adoption? Yes, yeah. I mean, but Stack Overflow and other surveys, do see C Sharp being one of the top languages and .NET in terms of adoption. But could it grow more? Yeah. So who knows? Maybe there's more things in the pipeline that's going to be more exciting for us. But yeah, thanks for the kind words here, VG Online. This was a good conversation, Valley. Always good to sometimes take a step back from our daily grind and just talk about how things have evolved and how we are here and what we are looking at next. So that's it from
Thank you very
us,
much, Sam.
me and Valley. Yep, thank you, and bye bye.